I'd hunted in those mountains for 20 years, knew every track, every sound. But on that cold morning in 1997, I found footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instinct made me follow them. And that's when I found something no hunter expects, a Bigfoot dying on the ground. When it opened its eyes, I didn't see a beast. I saw something ancient, aware, and far too weak to lie. And what it managed to say about humanity, with the last words of its life, wasn't a warning. It was something far more unsettling, something I was never meant to hear. My name is Mark Walker. I'm 42 years old, and I've been living alone in a cabin outside of Crescent Lake, Oregon for the past 4 years. Most people in town know me as the guy who keeps to himself, who brings in deer and elk to the local butcher, who nods politely but never stays for conversation. They don't know about the 12 years I spent in the Army, about the jungles in Central America, about the night I carried my best friend's broken body through 11 hours of hell, only to watch him die on the medevac helicopter. They don't need to know. That Mark Walker died the same night Danny Rodriguez did. The morning started like most others. I woke at 5:30 in my small cabin, made coffee in the old Mr. Coffee machine that had been my only luxury purchase in years, and checked my gear. My Remington 700 was clean and ready. I maintained my weapons with the same discipline the Army had beaten into me, even if I couldn't maintain much else in my life. I was heading up to the northern ridge where I'd spotted elk sign 2 days prior. November hunting season was coming, and I needed to scout the territory. The drive up the logging road took 40 minutes in my '89 Ford F-150, the truck rattling over ruts and washouts that the timber companies had stopped maintaining years ago. The radio picked up only static this far from town, so I drove in silence, watching the mist curl between the Douglas firs like something alive. I parked at the end of the road and shouldered my pack. Besides the rifle, I carried water, a first aid kit, rope, my compass, and a topographic map in a waterproof case, old habits from my military days. My Motorola pager was clipped to my belt, though it rarely went off. The only person who had the number was the butcher in town, and he only called when he had work for me. The hike up to the ridge was steep but familiar. I'd walked these mountains as a kid, long before the Army, before Danny, before everything went to shit. My father had taught me to track here, to read the forest, to move quietly. He'd been a logger and a hunter, dead now for 15 years. Sometimes I wondered what he'd think of what I'd become, a ghost living in the woods, more comfortable with silence than people. 2 hours into the hike, I found the tracks. At first, I thought they were bear prints. They were in soft mud beside a seasonal creek, clear and deep. But as I crouched down to examine them, my trained eye caught the details that didn't fit. The print was massive, at least 17 inches long, but it wasn't a bear's paw. It had 5 distinct toes, arranged like a human foot, but much larger. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy, and the stride length between prints was easily 5.5 feet. I'd heard the stories, of course. Growing up in Oregon, you couldn't avoid Bigfoot tales, campfire stories, grainy photographs, breathless accounts from hikers who'd had too much to drink. I'd always filed it with UFOs and lake monsters, entertaining fiction, nothing more. But these tracks were real, fresh, maybe 6 hours old. And they were heading uphill away from any trail, into territory so remote that most hunters never bothered with it. I should have turned back. I should have marked the location and continued with my original plan. Instead, I found myself following the tracks, my hunter's curiosity overriding common sense. Whatever had made these prints was huge, and part of me, the part that had been numb for 4 years, wanted to know what it was. The tracks led me off the established game trails, through old-growth forest, where the canopy was so thick that the undergrowth was sparse and walking was easy. I moved quietly, automatically falling into the patrol patterns I'd learned in the jungle. Step, pause, listen, scan, repeat. The forest was unusually quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just the whisper of wind through branches and my own controlled breathing. After about an hour of tracking, I noticed blood. Small drops at first, dark and fresh on the moss. Then more, a scattered trail that paralleled the footprints. Whatever I was following was injured. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the old combat instinct kicking in. An injured animal was unpredictable, dangerous. I should have been more cautious, but something pulled me forward. The blood drops were increasing in frequency and size. Whatever was bleeding was getting worse. The tracks led to a rocky outcrop surrounded by ancient cedar trees. The blood trail ended at a small cave, really more of an overhang created by two massive boulders leaning against each other. And there, in the shadows, I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was too large, too impossibly shaped. Then it moved slightly, and I understood. A Bigfoot, a real living Bigfoot. It was lying on its side, its massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Even lying down, I could tell it was enormous. Had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe 7.5. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, matted now with blood along its left side. The face was partially hidden, turned away from me, but I could see the powerful jaw, the heavy brow ridge. For a long moment I just stood there, my rifle halfway raised, my mind racing. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was impossible. Bigfoot wasn't real. It was myth, folklore, misidentification. But the creature in front of me was undeniably real. And it was dying. I'd seen enough death to recognize it, in the jungle, in field hospitals, in Danny's eyes as he slipped away. This creature had the same look, the same shallow breathing, the same stillness of something approaching the end. Slowly, carefully, I lowered my rifle and took a step closer. The creature's eyes opened, deep brown, incredibly human in their awareness, and fixed on me. I froze, every instinct telling me to run. It could probably still kill me if it wanted to, injured or not. But it didn't move to attack. It just watched me with those impossibly intelligent eyes. And I saw something there I recognized. Pain, yes, but also resignation, acceptance, and something else. Recognition, maybe, as if it had been expecting me. "Easy," I heard myself say, my voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature made a sound, low, rumbling, not quite a growl, but not human either. It shifted slightly, and I saw the wound more clearly, a massive gash along its ribs, deep and ragged. Not from a weapon. This looked like it had fallen, maybe caught itself on a broken branch or sharp rock. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped. In a human, this would require immediate surgery. Here, miles from any help, it was a death sentence. I unslung my pack, moving slowly, deliberately. The creature watched but didn't react as I pulled out my first aid kit. It was woefully inadequate for a wound this size, but I had to do something. I couldn't just watch it die. "I'm a medic," I said quietly, knowing it probably couldn't understand me, but needing to fill the silence. Well, I was, long time ago. I'm going to try to help, okay? I approached cautiously, and the creature's eyes followed me. When I was close enough to touch, I paused, giving it a chance to reject my help. It made another sound, softer this time, almost questioning. And then, incredibly, it shifted its position slightly to give me better access to the wound. It was trusting me. My hands were shaking as I opened my kit. The wound was worse up close, deep enough that I could see muscle and possibly bone. It needed stitches, antibiotics, a real hospital. All I had were some gauze pads, medical tape, and a small bottle of antiseptic that would barely make a dent. "This is going to hurt," I warned, pouring antiseptic over the wound. The creature tensed but didn't pull away. I worked quickly, using every scrap of gauze I had to pack the wound and wrapping it as tightly as I could with the tape and some rope from my pack. It wasn't enough. We both knew it wasn't enough. When I finished, I sat back on my heels, looking at this impossible being. Up close, I could see the silver hairs mixed in with the brown, the deep lines around its eyes, the worn look of something that had lived a very long time. "How old are you?" I asked quietly, not expecting an answer. The creature looked at me for a long moment. Then, incredibly, it spoke. The voice was deep, resonant, the words heavily accented but unmistakable. 102 years. I nearly fell backward in shock. It could talk. It could speak English. You can understand me?" The creature's lips pulled back slightly. Was that a smile? "I have listened to your kind for many years, learned words." Each word came slowly, painfully, like speaking was a tremendous effort. "The wound," I started, but it cut me off with a slight shake of its massive head. "Too late," it said simply. "I am old. This body is finished." It took a labored breath. "But I am glad you came." "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because I have something to say about your kind." It closed its eyes briefly, gathering strength. "And someone needs to hear it." I sat down fully, my rifle forgotten beside me, staring at this dying creature that shouldn't exist but did. And I realized, with a clarity I hadn't felt in 4 years, that I was about to hear something important, something that would matter. The creature opened its eyes again, and in them I saw a depth of experience, of observation, of accumulated wisdom that made my 42 years seem like nothing. "Listen," it said, and I leaned closer. "Listen, and remember." The creature, I couldn't keep thinking of it as just it, shifted slightly against the rock, trying to find a more comfortable position. The movement brought a grimace of pain to its face, so human in expression that it made my chest tight. "What do I call you?" I asked. "Do you have a name?" It considered this for a moment, its breathing labored. "My people do not use names like yours, but..." It paused, gathering strength. "The old ones, who lived before me, they called me Observer, because I watch, always watching." "Observer," I repeated. The name fit. Those deep brown eyes held the weight of someone who'd spent a century doing exactly that, watching, learning, understanding. "I'm Mark," I said, feeling foolish introducing myself to a dying Bigfoot, but unable to think of anything else to do. "Mark," it repeated, the word coming out softer than my own pronunciation. "You are Hunter." "Yes," I admitted, "though I wasn't hunting you. I didn't even believe your kind existed until about 20 minutes ago." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Observer's eyes. "Most of your kind do not believe. That is our advantage, our survival." Another labored breath. "But now, it does not matter. Soon, I will be gone. My people are already ghosts." "There are others?" I asked. "More of you?" "Few," Observer said. "Very few. Once, when I was young, there were more. But we do not breed often. And your kind spreads everywhere, takes everything." The words weren't accusatory, just factual, which somehow made them hit harder. I pulled my water bottle from my pack and offered it. Observer looked at it curiously, then accepted it with surprising delicacy, those massive fingers handling the plastic bottle carefully. It took a small sip, then another, before handing it back. "Thank you," it said, and I was struck again by the surreal nature of this. Sitting in the Oregon wilderness, sharing water with a cryptid that was thanking me in English. "You said you had something to tell me," I prompted gently. "About humanity." Observer nodded slowly. "Yes, I have watched your kind for 102 years, watched you grow, spread, change. I have seen 3 great wars, seen your machines become magic, seen your numbers multiply like rabbits." It paused, and when it continued, there was something heavier in its tone. "And I have seen what you do not see about yourselves." I leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite myself. This creature had lived through the entire 20th century, watching humanity from the shadows. What must that have looked like? What patterns had it observed that we, caught up in our daily lives, couldn't see? "Tell me," I said. Observer's eyes drifted upward, looking at the canopy above us. "When I was young, your kind traveled on horses, used simple tools, cut trees with handsaws. The forest could heal faster than you could wound it." Its gaze returned to me. "I thought you were like us, taking what you need, us, but no more." "But we're not," I said quietly, already knowing where this was heading. "No," Observer confirmed. "You have sickness in your spirit. You cannot stop taking. First, you needed wood, for warmth, for shelter. Understandable. Then you wanted more wood, for money, for, what did I hear it called? Economy." The word came out awkward, foreign in its mouth. "You cut, faster than trees can grow. You build, roads everywhere. You fill the sky with poison from your machines. I wanted to defend humanity, to argue that we'd also done good things, made progress, advanced civilization. But sitting there with this dying creature who'd watched us for a century, the arguments felt hollow. I watched the first automobile come to these mountains," Observer continued, its voice growing slightly stronger as it warmed to the subject, or perhaps it was just the adrenaline of knowing its time was short. 1917, loud smoking thing. I thought it was sick, but no, that is how all your machines work, taking ancient life from deep in the earth, burning it, filling the air with death. It shifted again, wincing. I watched the loggers come. First, a few men with axes, then bigger groups, then machines, chainsaws that scream, like demons. In my life, I have watched 90% of the old forest disappear. The grandmother trees, the ones that stood for 1,000 years, gone in minutes. "I know," I said, and I did. I'd seen the clear cuts, the vast swaths of mountainside stripped bare. Even as someone who hunted and used the forest's resources, the destruction had always unsettled me. We've gone too far." "Too far," Observer repeated. "Yes, but here is what terrifies me, what I must tell you, before I go." It locked eyes with me, and I saw an urgency there that made my skin prickle. "Your kind knows, you know, what you are doing. I have heard your scientists. I have listened to your radio broadcasts. From the boxes people carry, they say the air is warming, the ice is melting, the animals are dying. They warn you." "Climate change," I said. "Yeah, the scientists have been talking about it more lately." "And yet," Observer said, its voice dropping to barely a whisper, "you do nothing. You know, the cliff is ahead. You see it coming, and you drive faster." The creature's eyes glistened. Was it crying? "That is what terrifies me. Not that you destroy by accident, but that you destroy knowing, choosing." The words hit me like a physical blow, because it was true. God help me, it was true. We did know. The warnings had been there for decades, and we just kept going, kept consuming, kept building, kept burning fossil fuels and cutting down forests and pretending someone else would fix it. "My people," Observer continued, "we die because you leave us no room, but you die because you cannot stop eating your own world. That is the terrible truth. You are smart enough to see, but not wise enough to change." I sat in silence, the weight of the observation crushing. Here was a creature from a species that had survived for who knows how long by living in balance with the forest, by taking only what they needed, by remaining invisible and careful. And they were being wiped out by a species that knew better but couldn't stop destroying even its own future. "Is that why you wanted to talk to me?" I asked. "To tell me we're doomed?" "No," Observer said, and for the first time, something like warmth entered its voice. "I wanted to tell you, because you're different. Different how? You carry death inside you. I see it, I smell it, not sickness, but grief, loss. You have watched someone die, someone you loved. Observer's eyes were knowing, penetrating. That changes a person, makes them understand what matters. My throat tightened. I hadn't talked about Danny in 4 years, hadn't let myself think about him more than necessary. My best friend, I heard myself say. Danny Rodriguez, he died in my arms. Yes, Observer said gently. You carry him? Still. That weight, it makes you different from others of your kind. It makes you see. See what? That life is precious. That time is short. That taking leaves you empty. Observer took a shaky breath. Your kind is young. Young species, like young people, think they will live forever. Make mistakes because they cannot imagine the end. But you have touched death. You know, the end comes. I wiped at my eyes, surprised to find them wet. And what am I supposed to do with that? Remember, Observer said simply. Remember what I tell you. Remember that old one who lived 102 years, watched your kind, rushed toward cliff, and begged you to turn around. Its breathing was becoming more labored now, the words coming slower. Tell others. Plant. Seeds. Maybe they will not grow in time. Maybe your kind is already past the point of saving. But maybe not. I'm just one person, I protested. I live alone in the woods. I barely talk to anyone. Who's going to listen to me? You were soldier, Observer said. You know about missions, about doing your part even when outcome uncertain. It reached out with one massive hand, and I let it rest on my shoulder. The weight was immense, but gentle. This is your mission now. Carry my words. Tell them. Old One watched and warned. Tell them it is not too late to choose differently. The hand slipped from my shoulder, falling heavily to the ground. Observer's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. I could see it fading, the light in those ancient eyes dimming. Wait, I said urgently. I have questions about your people, about how you've survived, about... No time for questions, Observer interrupted. Only time for truth. And truth is simple. It fixed me with one last penetrating look. Your kind has greatness in it. I have seen your music, your art, your capacity for love, for sacrifice. You are not evil, just young, foolish, afraid. Afraid of what? Of changing, of giving up comfort, of admitting you were wrong. Observer's voice was barely audible now. But change is only path forward. Either you change the way you live on this earth, or the earth will change you through suffering, through loss, through death of everything you love. The creature's eyes closed, then opened again with what seemed like tremendous effort. Promise me, it whispered. Promise you will remember. Promise you will try. I promise, I said, my voice breaking. I swear it. I'll remember. I'll try. Observer's face relaxed into something that might have been peace. Good. That is all I can ask. One human who hears, who understands, who might plant seed that grows. After I am gone, a long, rattling breath. I am ready now, ready to rest. Is there anything I can do, I asked desperately, to make you more comfortable? You already did, Observer said softly. You stayed. You listened. You cared. That is more than I expected. More than most of your kind would give. Another pause, longer this time. Mark Walker, thank you for bearing my final words. Use them wisely. I sat with Observer as its breathing grew shallower, as the pauses between breaths grew longer. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath too, as if the trees themselves knew something ancient was passing from the world. "Observer," I said quietly, "I'm sorry for what my kind has done. Sorry you had to live through watching us destroy your home. Sorry that you're dying alone, far from your people." The creature's eyes opened one last time, and in them I saw not anger or bitterness, but something that looked almost like forgiveness. "Not alone," it whispered. "You are here. That matters. Everything matters." Those were its last words. I watched as Observer's chest rose one final time, held for a moment, then settled into stillness. The light in those ancient eyes faded, and the creature that had walked the earth for 102 years, that had witnessed the entire 20th century from the shadows, was gone. I sat there for a long time, my hand on Observer's cooling shoulder, tears streaming down my face. I'd cried exactly once in the 4 years since Danny died, at his funeral briefly, before shoving the grief down where it couldn't hurt me. But now the dam had broken, and I wept not just for this ancient being, but for Danny, for the forests being destroyed, for a world rushing toward a cliff while refusing to turn around. When I finally stood, my legs were numb from sitting so long. The sun had moved considerably. I'd been there for hours. I looked down at Observer's body, at the massive form that would soon return to the earth it had walked for over a century. I couldn't leave it here. I couldn't let hunters or hikers find it, couldn't let Observer become a spectacle or a trophy or a circus sideshow. The creature had asked me to remember, to carry its words. The least I could do was give it dignity in death. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering stones and branches, building a cairn over Observer's body. It was hard work, made harder by the tears that kept blurring my vision, but I didn't stop until the body was completely covered. It wouldn't last forever, nothing did, but it would protect Observer long enough for nature to reclaim what was hers. As I placed the final stone, I spoke aloud, feeling foolish, but needing to say something. "I'll remember, Observer. I'll carry your words. I'll try to make people understand. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but I'll try." The wind rustled through the trees, and for just a moment, I could almost believe it was an answer. The hike back down the mountain took twice as long as it should have. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying Observer's words, the weight of that ancient gaze, the terrible truths spoken with a dying breath. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost offensive in their beauty. The world looked exactly the same as it had this morning, but I had fundamentally changed. You can't sit with a dying creature that spent a century watching your species destroy the world and come away unchanged. I drove back to my cabin in a daze, the truck navigating the familiar roads on autopilot. When I finally pulled up to the small structure I called home, it was full dark. I sat in the truck for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at nothing. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than usual. One room with a bed, a small kitchen area, a wood stove for heat, and shelves lined with books I'd read dozens of times. My life, reduced to its bare essentials. It had felt like enough before. Now it felt like hiding. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my small table with a notebook I usually used for tracking game movements and weather patterns, and I started writing. Everything Observer had said, every word I could remember, every inflection and pause. My handwriting was messy, urgent, the pen moving faster than my thoughts could organize themselves. When I finished, it was past midnight. I had 7 pages of cramped writing, and it still felt inadequate. How do you capture the weight of a century's observation? How do you convey the sadness in those ancient eyes, the resignation mixed with desperate hope? I read through what I'd written, then read it again. Observer's message was clear. Humanity was rushing toward catastrophe. We knew it, and we were choosing not to change. And I, a broken ex-soldier living alone in the woods, was supposed to somehow make people care. It felt impossible, overwhelming. I was one person, and not even a particularly functional one. I'd spent 4 years avoiding human connection, pushing away anyone who tried to get close. What made Observer think I could suddenly become some kind of messenger? But I'd made a promise. And if 20 years of military service had taught me anything, it was that you kept your promises, especially the ones made to the dying. The next morning, I drove into Crescent Lake. The town was small, maybe 800 people, most of them loggers or working in the handful of businesses that served the logging industry. I usually came in once a week to sell game meat to Bill Henderson at the butcher shop, pick up supplies, and leave as quickly as possible. Today, I parked in front of the public library. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, looked up in surprise when I walked in. I'd been in here maybe twice in 4 years, both times to use the photocopier. "Mark Walker," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "What brings you in today?" "I need to research something," I said, feeling awkward. "About climate change, environmental science, that sort of thing." Margaret's eyebrows rose, but she didn't ask questions. She led me to a section near the back, pulling out books and periodicals. "We don't have a huge collection, but these should get you started. Are you looking for anything specific?" "Just trying to understand the scope of it, I guess. How bad things are. What the scientists are saying." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll leave you to it. Let me know if you need help finding anything else." I spent the next 4 hours reading. Reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, articles about deforestation rates, species extinction, ocean acidification, projections about temperature rise, sea level increase, ecosystem collapse. The more I read, the more Observer's words made sense. The science was clear, the warnings were everywhere. And yet the logging trucks still rumbled past the library window every hour. The parking lot was full of gas-guzzling pickup trucks. Life continued as normal, as if the cliff wasn't rushing toward us, or we toward it. Around noon, Margaret brought me a cup of coffee and a sandwich she'd apparently gotten from the diner next door. "You've been at this for hours," she said gently. "Thought you might need fuel." "Thank you," I said, surprised by the gesture. "You didn't have to—" "I know," she interrupted with a smile, "but you looked like a man on a mission, and missions require sustenance." She hesitated, then asked, "What sparked this sudden interest, if you don't mind me asking?" I considered lying, or deflecting, or giving some vague answer. Instead, I heard myself say, "I saw something in the woods yesterday, something that made me realize I've been asleep, not paying attention to what matters." Margaret pulled up a chair and sat down. "I know that feeling. I spent 30 years as a teacher in Portland before I retired here, watched kids get more and more disconnected from nature, more absorbed in television and video games, watched the curriculum cut environmental science programs. Everyone so focused on jobs and economy that we forgot what we're all part of." "Do you think people can change?" I asked. "Really change, I mean. Not just talk about it, but actually alter how they live?" "Some can," Margaret said thoughtfully. "Most won't. Not until they're forced to, anyway. Humans are very good at ignoring problems until they become crises." She paused. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Every person who wakes up, who sees clearly and chooses differently, that matters, even if it feels like a drop in the ocean." "Observer said something similar," I muttered, then realized what I'd said. "Observer?" Margaret asked. "Someone I met," I said quickly. "Someone very old, very wise. They told me a lot of things I needed to hear." Almost Margaret didn't push, just nodded. "Well, I'm glad you're here, reading, learning, thinking. That's more than most people do." She stood up. "Take your time. Library's open until 6. After she left, I continued reading, taking notes in my notebook. By the time I left, I had a much clearer picture of what humanity was facing and how little time we might have to change course. Over the next week, I fell into a new routine, Mornings I'd work, hunting, processing meat, maintaining my cabin. Afternoons I'd be at the library reading everything I could find about environmental issues. Evenings I'd sit with my notebook trying to figure out how to turn Observer's message into something people might actually hear. The problem was that I didn't know how to talk to people anymore. 4 years of isolation had eroded whatever social skills I'd once had. And who was going to listen to a reclusive ex-soldier rambling about a dying Bigfoot's warnings about humanity? On the 8th day after Observer's death, I was at the butcher shop dropping off 2 dressed deer when Bill Henderson asked me something that changed everything. "Mark, you know anything about tracking?" he asked, wrapping the meat and marking it for sale. "Some," I said carefully. I knew more than some. I'd been one of the best trackers in my unit, but I'd learned not to advertise my skills. "My nephew's Boy Scout troop is looking for someone to teach them wilderness skills," Bill explained. "Tracking, basic survival, that sort of thing. Leader who usually does it moved away. I thought of you." Every instinct screamed to say no, to keep my head down, maintain my isolation, avoid getting involved with people, especially kids. But then I thought about Observer, about the promise I'd made, about planting seeds. "When?" I heard myself ask. Bill's face lit up with surprise. "Really? You do it? They meet Saturday mornings at the community center. I can give you the Scoutmaster's number." "Okay," I said, my stomach churning with anxiety even as I said it. "Yeah, I'll do it." That Saturday, I stood in front of 12 boys aged 11 to 14, all of them staring at me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Their Scoutmaster, a friendly man named Robert Torres, had introduced me as an experienced outdoorsman who's agreed to teach you some advanced skills. I'd barely slept the night before, rehearsing what to say, fighting the urge to cancel. I wasn't good with people anymore, wasn't good with kids. What was I thinking? But I'd made a promise. "I'm Mark Walker," I started, my voice rougher than I'd intended. "I'm going to teach you how to read the forest, how to track animals, how to move quietly, how to see what most people miss." One kid raised his hand immediately. "Have you ever tracked anything dangerous, like a bear or a mountain lion?" "Yes," I said simply. Then, before I could stop myself, "and something most people don't believe exists." That got their attention. 12 pairs of eyes locked on me. "What was it?" another boy asked eagerly. I paused, thinking about Observer, about the promise to carry its words. This wasn't how I'd planned to start, but maybe it was the right moment. Kids hadn't learned to dismiss things yet, hadn't built up the walls of skepticism that adults wore, like armor. "Before I tell you," I said, "I need you to understand something. The wilderness isn't just a playground or a resource to be used. It's home to creatures that were here long before us, that have as much right to exist as we do. And right now, we're taking that home away from them. We're cutting down their forests, polluting their air and water, changing their climate. We're doing it so fast that they can't adapt." I saw some confusion on their faces, but also interest. Robert was watching me carefully, probably wondering where this was going. "Last week," I continued, "I tracked something into the mountains, something I didn't believe was real, and I found it dying. Not from old age alone, but from losing its home, from having nowhere left to go that was safe from humans and our machines." "What was it?" the first boy asked again, leaning forward. "You'd call it Bigfoot," I said quietly. "I call it Observer. And before it died, it told me things about humanity that everyone needs to hear, especially young people like you, because you're the ones who'll inherit the world we're leaving behind." The room was completely silent now. Even Robert was leaning in, his expression somewhere between skeptical and fascinated. "Observer lived for 102 years, I said. It watched the entire 20th century unfold, watched us go from horses and hand tools to cars and chainsaws and factories that poison the sky. And you know what terrified it most? Not that we're destroying the planet by accident, but that we're doing it knowingly, that we see the cliff ahead and keep driving toward it anyway. Teus. One of the older boys spoke up, his tone challenging. You really expect us to believe you met a Bigfoot? I don't care if you believe me, I said honestly. What matters is the message. Whether it came from a Bigfoot or a dying old man or a voice in my head, the truth is the same. We're running out of time to change how we live on this earth. And you, all of you, you're going to have to deal with the consequences of choices my generation and the ones before made. I pulled out my notebook, the pages filled with observers' words and the research I'd been doing. I'm going to teach you tracking and survival skills like I promised. But I'm also going to teach you something more important. How to see the forest as a living system, not just a collection of resources. How to understand what we're losing, and maybe how to be part of the generation that finally turns around before we go over the cliff. The boys were quiet, processing. Then one of the younger ones, maybe 11, raised his hand tentatively. Yes, I said. If the Bigfoot was real, he asked seriously, and it lived that long and saw all that stuff, what did it want us to do? Did it have, like, a message? I felt my throat tighten. Yes, I said. It said that humans aren't evil, just young and scared of changing, of admitting we were wrong, of giving up comfort. But it also said we have greatness in us, capacity for love and sacrifice and making different choices. It asked me to remember and to tell others, so maybe someone would wake up in time. The boy nodded slowly, taking it seriously in a way that made my chest ache. Kids. They still had that openness, that ability to hear truth without layers of defensive cynicism. So, I said, my voice stronger now, who wants to learn how to read tracks? Every hand went up. The tracking lessons became a regular thing. Every Saturday morning, I'd meet with the Boy Scout troop, and we'd either work in the woods behind the community center or take field trips to different areas around Crescent Lake. I taught them how to identify prints, how to read scat and mark trees, how to move through the forest without disturbing it, but I also taught them other things, about ecosystem interconnection, about how clear-cutting affected water quality downstream, about the species that were disappearing from these mountains, not dramatically but quietly, year by year, as their habitat shrank. Some of the boys were more interested than others. A few clearly thought I was crazy, especially after that first day when I'd mentioned Observer. But a core group of 5 or 6 kept coming back, kept asking questions, kept wanting to learn more. One of them was Michael Santos, 13 years old, small for his age but sharp as a tack. After the third session, he approached me as the other boys were loading into their parents' cars. Mr. Walker, he said hesitantly, I've been thinking about what you said, about the Bigfoot, Observer, and about how we're destroying everything. Yeah, I said, packing up the tracking materials I'd brought. My dad works for Cascade Timber, Michael continued, his voice dropping. He's a feller, cuts down trees, and I heard him and his friends talking last week about how the environmentalists are trying to stop them from working, how it's going to cost jobs. But, he paused, struggling with something. But when you show us what's being lost, it makes me wonder if maybe the environmentalists are right. Does that make me a bad son? I stopped what I was doing and looked at him directly. This was the kind of moment Observer had been talking about, the choice point where someone could wake up or go back to sleep. No, I said firmly. It makes you someone who's thinking for himself. Your dad's not a bad person for cutting trees. He's doing what he needs to do to feed his family. But the system that makes him choose between his livelihood and the health of the forest, that's what's broken. So what do we do? Michael asked, and there was a real anguish in his voice. If we stop logging, people lose jobs. If we don't stop, we lose the forest. Either way, someone suffers. That's the trap, I said. That's how we've been thinking, like it's all or nothing, jobs or environment. But Observer showed me that's a false choice. The real question is, can we find a way to live that doesn't require destroying everything? Can we log sustainably, taking only what the forest can regenerate? Can we create jobs that help restore instead of destroy? Can we? Michael asked. I don't know, I admitted. But I know we have to try, because the current path, it ends with nobody having jobs and nobody having forests either. Michael nodded slowly, processing. Will you tell me more about Observer, about what it saw, about what you think we should do? Yeah, I said. Yeah, I can do that. Word spread the way it does in small towns. The weird hermit who claimed to have met a Bigfoot was teaching Boy Scouts about environmental issues. Reactions were mixed. Bill Henderson thought it was great. His nephew was suddenly interested in biology and wanted to be a wildlife ranger. Margaret Chen started attending some of the sessions, bringing books and articles to supplement what I was teaching. Robert Torres, the scoutmaster, was cautiously supportive, though I could tell he was fielding questions from some concerned parents. But I also started getting looks around town, the kind of looks that said troublemaker or tree hugger or worse. A few people made pointed comments about how logging put food on tables, and maybe I should remember that before filling kids' heads with nonsense. The tension came to a head 3 weeks after I'd started teaching, when I was confronted at the diner by a man named Dale Pritchard. He was a timber company supervisor, a big guy with a red face and hands like sledgehammers. He cornered me as I was finishing breakfast. "You Walker?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the small restaurant. "That's me," I said, staying seated, keeping my voice calm. I'd dealt with aggressive men before. "You're the one telling those kids that logging is destroying the planet," Dale said, moving closer, "that we're all evil for doing our jobs." "I never said anyone was evil," I replied evenly. "I said we're making choices that have consequences. There's a difference." "Bullshit," Dale spat. "You're spreading propaganda, filling kids' heads with lies. My son came home the other day asking me if I was killing the earth. He's 12 years old, and you made him feel guilty about his own father." I could feel the attention of everyone in the diner on us. This was a logging town. Most of these people either worked in timber or depended on those who did. I was very much the outsider here. "I'm sorry your son felt that way," I said carefully. "But maybe instead of being angry at me, you should ask yourself why the truth makes him uncomfortable. The science is clear, Dale. We're cutting faster than the forest can regenerate. That's not propaganda. That's math." "Science?" Dale sneered. "You know what I know? I know that I've worked these forests for 20 years. I know how to do my job sustainably. I know that we replant, that we follow regulations, that we're not the villains you make us out to be." "I know you replant," I said, "but a tree farm isn't a forest. It's a crop. And it doesn't support the same diversity of life, doesn't have the same carbon storage capacity, doesn't provide the same ecosystem services as old-growth forest." Dale's face was getting redder. "You think you're so smart coming in here with your books and your fancy words. You're just a burned-out soldier playing at being a teacher. You don't know anything about real work, about supporting a family, about what it takes to survive in the real world." Something cold settled in my chest. "I know about survival," I said quietly. "I survived things you can't imagine. I watched my best friend die because I couldn't carry him fast enough through the jungle. And you know what he said to me before he died? He said, 'Make it count, Mark. Make the time you have count for something.'" I stood up, my breakfast forgotten. For 4 years I hid in the woods, told myself I was done with the world, done with people, done with trying to make a difference. Then I met something that had watched humanity for a century, and it told me that we're committing suicide, slowly but surely, and most of us are too blind or too scared to admit it. The diner was completely silent now. Dale was staring at me, his anger mixed with something else, uncertainty, maybe, or recognition. "So, yeah," I continued, "I'm teaching kids to see clearly, to understand what we're losing, to maybe, just maybe, be the generation that makes different choices than we did. If that makes me a troublemaker, fine. I'd rather be a troublemaker who tried than a coward who stayed silent." I threw money on the counter for my meal and walked out, my hands shaking from adrenaline. Behind me, I heard murmurs of conversation, but I didn't look back. That afternoon, I hiked back up to Observer's cairn. I did this every few days now, checking to make sure the stones hadn't been disturbed, spending time in the quiet, trying to feel connected to the promise I'd made. As I approached the site, I saw someone was already there, an elderly Native American woman sitting on the ground near the cairn, her eyes closed. She wore traditional clothing and had long gray hair braided down her back. I stopped, unsure whether to approach or leave her in peace. But she opened her eyes and looked directly at me, as if she'd known I was there all along. "You're the one who built this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said carefully. "I found someone here, someone who died. I wanted to give them dignity." The woman studied me for a long moment. "My name is Sarah Whitebear. I'm from the Klamath tribes. These are our traditional lands, though your government wouldn't recognize that." She gestured to the cairn. "This is sacred ground now. You did a good thing, honoring the passing of one of the old ones." My heart started racing. "You know what this was?" "What I found. My people have always known about the forest people," Sarah said simply. "We called them Tzemekwes. They were here before us, and they'll be here after us, or would have been, if your kind hadn't taken everything." She stood, her movements fluid despite her apparent age. "Word travels among my people. We heard that a white man found one of the old ones, dying, that he sat with it and listened, that he covered its body with respect. That's rare. Usually your kind either runs away or tries to take trophies." "It asked me to remember," I said, "to carry its words about humanity, about the choices we're making." "And are you," Sarah asked, "carrying those words?" "I'm trying," I said, "teaching kids, reading, learning, trying to figure out how one person can possibly make a difference when the whole system is designed to keep grinding forward." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't, how can one person change everything? The question is, what is my part to play? You don't have to save the world, Mark Walker. You just have to do your piece." "That's what Observer said," I replied. "It called it planting seeds. But I don't know if I'm planting them right, or if they'll grow, or if there's even enough time." "There's never enough time," Sarah said. "There's never enough certainty. But that doesn't excuse us from trying." She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I brought something for you, for the old one." She unwrapped it to reveal a beautifully carved wooden pendant on a leather cord, a circle with symbols I didn't recognize. "This is a blessing in our tradition, for safe journey to the next world." She placed it on top of the cairn, speaking words in a language I didn't understand. When she finished, she turned back to me. "The old ones are dying, Mark. Not just from old age, but from grief, from watching everything they knew disappear. But before they go, some of them are speaking to people like you, people who might listen. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But you might be one of the ones who actually does something with what you were told." "What should I do?" I asked, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "What you're already doing," Sarah said. "Teach, speak truth, plant seeds. Connect with others who are trying to make a difference. And there are more than you think. My people, we've been fighting this fight for 500 years. We've lost most of the battles, but we keep fighting because what else can we do? Give up? Let them take everything without witness?" She placed a hand on my shoulder, and I felt warmth spread from the contact. "The old one chose well when it chose you. You're broken enough to understand loss, strong enough to carry the weight, and stubborn enough not to quit when it gets hard. Those are the qualities that matter." "I'm scared," I admitted. "Scared I'll fail. Scared it's already too late." "Of course you're scared," Sarah said. "Anyone with sense is scared." But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite the fear. It's standing up even when you're shaking. It's planting seeds even when you're not sure they'll grow. She started to walk away, then paused. "There's a gathering next month. Environmental groups, tribal representatives, scientists, activists, they're organizing to fight a major expansion of logging in the Cascade Range. You should come. Bring your story. Let others hear what the old one told you." "I don't know if anyone will believe me," I said. Sarah smiled. "Some will, some won't. But the ones who need to hear it will be listening. That's all that matters." She gave me an address and date. "Think about it. The old one's words shouldn't stay locked in your notebook. They should be spoken, shared, planted in as many minds as possible." After she left, I sat by the cairn for a long time, thinking about what she'd said, about doing my part, about courage being action despite fear, about the network of people already fighting, already trying to make a difference. Observer had been right. Humans had greatness in them. I'd seen it in Michael Santos questioning his assumptions, in Margaret Chen sharing her knowledge, in Sarah Whitebear keeping sacred traditions alive, in the boys who kept showing up every Saturday despite their friends calling them tree huggers. The seeds were being planted slowly, quietly, one mind at a time. Maybe they'd grow fast enough, maybe they wouldn't. But I'd promised to try. As I stood to leave, I touched the cairn one last time. "I'm doing my part, Observer," I said aloud. "I hope it's enough." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and earth, and I chose to hear it as an answer. The gathering Sarah had mentioned was held in a community hall in Eugene, about 2 hours' drive from Crescent Lake. I almost didn't go. The morning of the event, I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and go home. I'd spent 4 years avoiding exactly this: rooms full of people, conversations, connection. The thought of standing in front of strangers and telling Observer's story made my chest tight with anxiety. But I'd made a promise to a dying creature that had lived 102 years. My discomfort seemed pretty insignificant compared to that. The hall was larger than I'd expected, maybe 100 people scattered among rows of folding chairs. I recognized the types immediately: environmental activists in worn flannel and hiking boots, tribal representatives in both traditional and modern dress, academics with their briefcases and note-filled folders, a few journalists with cameras and recorders. Sarah found me almost immediately, appearing at my elbow as I stood awkwardly near the back. "You came," she said, genuine warmth in her voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I promised," I said simply. "Good." She guided me toward a group of people near the front. "There are some folks I want you to meet." Over the next hour, I was introduced to what felt like dozens of people. Dr. Elizabeth Mora, a wildlife biologist from Oregon State, who'd been documenting species decline in the Cascades. James Riverwind, a Warm Springs tribal elder who'd been fighting logging expansion for decades. Patricia Chen, Margaret's daughter it turned out, who worked for the Sierra Club. Journalists, activists, scientists, all of them engaged in different aspects of the same fight Observer had described. What struck me most was how many of them looked tired, not physically, though some clearly were, but tired in their souls. These were people who'd been fighting for years, for decades in some cases, watching small victories get swallowed by larger defeats. They had the same look I'd seen in Observer's eyes, the exhaustion of watching something precious slip away despite your best efforts. The formal program started around 10. Various speakers presented data on deforestation rates, species extinction, climate impacts. The numbers were staggering, worse even than what I'd read in my library research. The Cascade Range was losing old-growth forest at an accelerating rate. Critical habitat for spotted owls, marbled murrelets, Pacific fishers, and dozens of other species was being fragmented beyond recovery. Carbon that had been stored in ancient trees for centuries was being released into an already warming atmosphere. But there was also talk of resistance, legal challenges being mounted, direct action campaigns being planned, sustainable forestry alternatives being developed. These people hadn't given up, even though they had every reason to. During the lunch break, Sarah found me again. "There's an open mic session this afternoon," she said, "for people to share their stories, their reasons for being here. I think you should speak." I don't know, I said, the anxiety returning. I'm not good at public speaking. And the Bigfoot thing, people will think I'm crazy. Some will, Sarah agreed, but others won't. And mark these people, they're exhausted. They've been fighting so long with so little to show for it. They need to remember why they started. They need to hear that this isn't just about statistics and policy. It's about real beings, real lives, real loss. She paused. Observer's story could remind them of that, could give them strength to keep going. I thought about Observer's words, about planting seeds, about doing my part. Okay, I said, I'll try. When the open mic session started, I sat through several speakers first. A young woman who'd been arrested for tree sitting, an elderly farmer talking about how changing weather patterns were destroying his crops, a Native American teenager describing what it felt like to watch sacred sites bulldozed for logging roads. Each story added weight to the others, building a picture of a world under siege, of people trying desperately to protect what remained. Finally, Sarah called my name. Mark Walker from Crescent Lake. He has a story that needs to be heard. I walked to the front on shaking legs, acutely aware of 100 pairs of eyes on me. I'd faced enemy fire with less fear than I felt in that moment. At least in combat, you knew who your enemies were. My name is Mark Walker, I started, my voice rougher than I'd intended. 6 weeks ago, I didn't believe in Bigfoot. I didn't believe in much of anything, really. I was just existing, hiding in the woods, avoiding people, trying not to think too hard about anything. I pulled out my notebook, the pages worn now from repeated reading. Then I found tracks, huge prints that didn't match any animal I knew. I followed them, and I found someone, something. A creature that stood over 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, with eyes that held more intelligence and awareness than most humans I've met. I heard murmurs in the audience, skepticism, curiosity, maybe a few eye rolls. I pushed forward. It was dying. A bad wound, but more than that, it was old. 102 years old, it told me. It had lived through the entire 20th century, watching humanity from the shadows of these forests. And before it died, it asked me to remember what it said, to carry its words to others who might listen. My hands were shaking now, but I read from my notebook anyway, Observer's words about watching the forests disappear, about seeing humanity rush toward a cliff while knowing exactly what we were doing, about the terrible truth that we're destroying the world, not by accident, but by choice. It called us young, I continued, looking up from the notebook, a young species still learning, still making terrible mistakes. But it also said, we have greatness in us, capacity for love, for sacrifice, for change. It asked me, begged me, to plant seeds, to tell others, to maybe help someone wake up before it's too late. The room was completely silent now. I could see different reactions, some people riveted, others uncomfortable, a few clearly thinking I was delusional. I don't care if you believe me about the Bigfoot, I said, echoing what I'd told the Boy Scouts. What matters is the message. We are running out of time. The forests are dying. The climate is changing. Species are disappearing, and we know it. God help us. We know it. But we keep acting like someone else will fix it, like we have time to worry about it later, like the economy or jobs or convenience matter more than the habitability of the planet. I closed the notebook. Observer died alone on a mountainside, the last of its kind in these mountains. It spent a century watching us destroy its home, and with its last breath, it tried to warn us that we're destroying ours too. That's what brought me here. That's why I'm standing in front of strangers telling a story that makes me sound insane. Because I made a promise to a dying creature that I would try, that I would do my part. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. We're all here because we're trying to do our part, fighting legal battles, documenting species, protecting sacred sites, teaching kids, writing articles. It feels hopeless sometimes. It feels like we're shouting into a hurricane. But Observer spent 102 years watching and hoping, and it didn't give up. How can we? I returned to my seat, my legs weak, my heart pounding. The silence stretched for a long moment, and then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then more, until most of the room was applauding. Not everyone. I could see some skeptical faces, some people clearly dismissing my story as fantasy or metaphor. But enough to matter. After the session, people approached me. Some wanted details about Observer, where I'd found it, what it looked like, whether I had proof. I told them the location would stay secret, a sacred site that deserved protection and privacy. As for proof, I had only my word and my notebook, and that would have to be enough. But others understood that the specifics didn't matter as much as the message. Dr. Mora talked to me about the species she was documenting, about how she sometimes felt like she was just recording extinctions rather than preventing them. "Your story reminded me why I started," she said quietly. "Not for data or publications, but because these creatures matter. Their lives matter. Thank you for that." James Riverwind pulled me aside and told me stories from his own tradition about the forest people, about how his grandfather had encountered one as a young man and had been taught lessons about living in balance. "The old ones are dying," he said, echoing Sarah's words, "but they're trying to teach us before they go. Some of us are listening." Even some of the skeptics approached, not to mock, but to engage. A journalist asked thoughtful questions about how my military background influenced my perspective on environmental issues. An activist wanted to know if I'd be willing to share my story at other gatherings, to help build momentum for the legal challenges being mounted. By the time I left, I had a folder full of materials, contact information, upcoming events, research papers, strategic plans. I also had something less tangible, but more important, the sense that I wasn't alone in this, that there was a network of people fighting the same fight, planting the same seeds, holding on to hope despite the odds. The drive back to Crescent Lake felt different than the drive there. I'd left my cabin that morning feeling isolated and uncertain. I returned feeling connected to something larger than myself. When I got home, there were 3 messages on the answering machine I barely used. Margaret Chen letting me know that Michael Santos's father wanted to talk to me. Patricia Chen saying she'd been at the gathering and wanted to discuss bringing an environmental education program to Crescent Lake. And Sarah Whitebear simply saying, "You did good, Mark. The old one would be proud." I made coffee and sat at my table with all the materials I'd gathered, plans for legal challenges to logging expansion, proposals for sustainable forestry alternatives, educational programs being developed, networks of activists, scientists, and indigenous leaders coordinating their efforts. It was overwhelming, but in a different way than before. Not the paralysis of one person facing an impossible task, but the complexity of many people working together towards something difficult, but possible. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the work. I continued teaching the Boy Scouts, expanding the program to include broader environmental topics. I started attending town council meetings, speaking up about conservation issues, sharing data and research. I worked with Patricia Chen to bring educational materials into the local schools, despite resistance from some parents and administrators. Most surprisingly, I met with Dale Pritchard, the timber supervisor who'd confronted me at the diner. His son, it turned out, was one of the boys in my scout group, and the kid had been asking uncomfortable questions at home. Dale wanted to tell me to back off, but instead we ended up having a 3-hour conversation about sustainable forestry, about how the current system was destroying both the forests and the long-term viability of logging jobs. "My grandfather was a logger," Dale said over coffee at his kitchen table. "He worked the same forest for 40 years, selective cutting, letting areas recover before going back. Made a good living, never had to worry about running out of trees. Then the big companies came in, brought the clear cutting, the quotas, the quarterly profits mentality. Now we're cutting areas that were supposed to be off limits just to meet the numbers." So what do we do? I asked, genuinely curious. Dale knew the industry from the inside in ways I never would. We fight for different rules, Dale said. Longer rotation times, smaller cut blocks, protection for old growth. It'll mean fewer jobs in the short term, but those jobs will last. The current system, we're going to log ourselves out of work within 20 years anyway. He agreed to come speak to the scout troop about responsible forestry practices. He also started talking to other loggers about forming a coalition to push back against the most destructive industry practices. I never would have predicted it, but Dale Pritchard became one of my most effective allies. 3 months after Observer's death, I hiked back up to the cairn. It was late January now, snow covering the ground, the forest quiet and pristine in winter's grip. I'd been making this pilgrimage every few weeks, checking on the site, spending time in meditation or prayer or whatever you wanted to call it. This time, I brought something with me. A letter I'd written to Observer, documenting everything that had happened since its death. The Boy Scout program that had grown to include kids from 3 different troops. The legal challenges that were slowing logging expansion in critical areas. The coalition Dale had formed. The relationships I'd built with environmental groups and tribal leaders. The seeds that were starting to grow. I read the letter aloud at the cairn, my breath misting in the cold air. "I don't know if you can hear me," I said. "I don't know if there's anything after, if your spirit is somewhere listening, or if death is just silence. But I want you to know that I kept my promise. I remembered, I carried your words, I planted seeds." I paused, looking at the snow-covered stones. "You asked me if humans could change, if we could wake up in time. I still don't know the answer to that. The cliff is still ahead, and we're still driving toward it, but some of us are pumping the brakes, some of us are trying to turn the wheel. Maybe it won't be enough, probably it won't be enough, but we're trying." The wind moved through the trees, shaking snow from branches. In the silence of the winter forest, I felt a peace I hadn't known since before Danny died. Not the peace of completion, the work was far from done, but the peace of purpose, of knowing what I was meant to do and doing it. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. Thank you for giving me a reason to come back to life. Thank you for showing me that even at the end, even after watching a century of destruction, you could still hope. I'll carry that hope forward. I promise." As I started the long hike back down, I thought about Observer's last words, that everything matters, that hope is small, like a seed in winter, but still alive, that humans are young and foolish and afraid, but also capable of greatness. I thought about Michael Santos, who'd convinced his school to start a recycling program, about Margaret Chen, who'd turned her library into an environmental education center, about Dale Pritchard, who was teaching other loggers about sustainable practices, about Sarah Whitebear, who'd been fighting for indigenous rights and environmental protection for decades and still hadn't given up. Seeds, all of them seeds, planted in the soil of a changing world. Some would grow quickly, some would take decades, some might not grow at all, but they were there in the ground, waiting for the right conditions. Observer had asked me if humans could change. I still didn't have a definitive answer, but I could say this: some of us were trying, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. 6 months after Observer's death, I stood in front of a packed town hall in Crescent Lake. The timber company had proposed a major expansion into the last significant old-growth area in the region. Ironically, the same mountains where I'd found Observer dying. The room was divided, loggers and their families on one side, environmentalists and concerned citizens on the other. The tension was thick enough to cut. I'd been asked to speak by both sides, somehow having become a bridge between two communities that usually saw each other as enemies. Dale stood with his workers, giving me an encouraging nod. Margaret sat with the environmental group, her daughter Patricia beside her. Sarah Whitebear was there with a delegation from the Klamath tribes. And in the back row, I saw Michael Santos with his mother, the boy having convinced his parents to come hear both sides. 6 months ago, I started, my voice carrying in the silent room. I met someone in those mountains who changed my life. Someone who'd lived there for over a century, who'd watched those forests grow and thrive, who'd seen what we've done to them in just a few decades. I told them about Observer, not dwelling on the Bigfoot aspect, but focusing on the message. About a century of observation, about the terrible truth of knowing destruction and choosing it anyway, about the hope that we could still change course if we tried. The question before us tonight, I continued, isn't really about this logging proposal. It's about what kind of people we want to be. Do we want to be the generation that cut down the last old-growth forests because it was profitable in the short term? Or do we want to be the generation that finally said enough and found a different way? I looked at Dale and his workers. The loggers in this room aren't villains. They're people trying to support their families, practicing skills passed down through generations. They deserve respect and they deserve jobs. Then I looked at the environmental groups. And the people fighting to protect these forests aren't naive tree huggers. They're people who understand that some things, once lost, can never be recovered. They deserve respect too. The real villain, I said, is a system that makes us choose between livelihoods and life support systems. That treats forests as inventory rather than living ecosystems. That measures value only in board feet and quarterly profits. I pulled out the carved pendant Sarah had given me, the one she'd placed on Observer's cairn. In Native American tradition, decisions are supposed to be made with the 7th generation in mind. What world are we leaving for our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren? Will they have forests to walk in, clean water to drink, stable climate to live in? The room was silent. I could see some people nodding, others looking uncomfortable, everyone at least listening. I'm not saying we stop all logging, I continued. I'm saying we do it differently. Longer rotations, selective cutting, protection for old growth and critical habitat, jobs that last because we're working with the forest's capacity to regenerate rather than against it. I looked around the room, trying to make eye contact with as many people as possible. Observer lived for 102 years. Most of us in this room will be lucky to see 80. What will we do with that time? What seeds will we plant? What world will we leave behind? Someone once told me that we don't have to save the world, we just have to do our part. This is our part, this decision tonight in this room. We can choose to keep doing what we've always done and get the results we've always gotten. Or we can choose something different. Something harder maybe, but something that might actually have a future. I stepped back from the microphone. That's all I have to say. Whatever you decide, decide with the 7th generation in mind. Decide like it matters, because it does. Everything matters. The vote that night didn't go entirely the way the environmental groups wanted, but it didn't go entirely the timber company's way either. A compromise was reached, limited logging in certain areas with strict protections for the old-growth groves and critical wildlife habitat. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. It was better. After the meeting, people from both sides approached me, some to thank me, some to argue, all of them at least engaged in the conversation. The division in the room hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. People were talking across the divide, trying to find common ground. Michael Santos found me as I was leaving. "Mr. Walker," he said, "my dad said to tell you that he still thinks you're crazy, but he also said you might be the good kind of crazy." I laughed, surprising myself. "I'll take that as a compliment." He also said, Michael continued more seriously, that he's glad someone's thinking about the 7th generation, even if it makes his job harder. As I drove home that night, I thought about Observer's question, could humans change? The answer, I realized, wasn't simple. Some could, some would, some were already trying. It wasn't everyone, and it might not be enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all you could ask for. 1 year later, I stood at Observer's cairn on a bright October morning, exactly 1 year after that first encounter. The stones were undisturbed, covered now with moss and autumn leaves. Sarah's pendant still rested on top, weathered but intact. "It's been a year," I said aloud, "my ritual now. Thought you'd want to know what your seeds have grown into." I told Observer about the expanding education program, now reaching 6 schools in the region, about the Sustainable Forestry Coalition that Dale had formed, which was actually influencing policy, about the legal protections that had been won for critical habitat, about the Boy Scout troop that had grown to 30 kids, many of them becoming passionate advocates for environmental protection. "Michael Santos is applying to colleges," I said. "Wants to study wildlife biology. He told me it's because of what you taught me and what I taught him. Your words are living on, Observer, growing, spreading, making a difference." I paused, thinking about all the changes in my own life. I'm not hiding anymore. I'm not that broken soldier living alone in the woods, afraid to connect with people. I'm part of something now, part of a community, a movement, a fight that matters. The wind rustled through the trees and I smiled. "You were right, you know, about humans having greatness in them. I've seen it this year, in kids asking hard questions, in workers demanding better practices, in activists never giving up, in tribal elders sharing ancient wisdom. We're young and foolish and afraid, just like you said, but we're also capable of change. Some of us, anyway." I placed my hand on the cairn, feeling the cool stone beneath my palm. "I miss you, Observer. I wish you could have lived to see this, but maybe you did, in a way. Your words are alive. Your hope is alive. The seeds you asked me to plant are growing. And I promise you this," I continued, my voice strong and clear, "I will keep planting them. I will keep telling your story. I will keep fighting for the 7th generation, for the forests, for the future. Not because I think we'll definitely win, but because you taught me that trying matters, that everything matters." The sun broke through the canopy, illuminating the cairn in golden light, and in that moment I felt what I could only describe as peace. Not the peace of a battle won, but the peace of a battle joined, the peace of knowing your purpose and living it. Observer had asked me if humans could change. After a year of watching, trying, fighting, planting seeds, I had my answer. We could. Some of us would. And that would have to be enough. Because in the end, as Observer had said with its last breath, everything matters. Everything.